I'm Luca Giliberti, contributing writer for Gold Derby, and I'm joined today by Millicent Shelton, who directed episodes 5 and 6 of Lessons in Chemistry.
Hi.
Millicent, you have directed a whole lot of television throughout your career, and you're also no stranger to coming on as a director a bit later in a show's run and having to work with a pre-existing tone. So to start things off, talk a bit about that process of coming onto Lessons in Chemistry and getting a grasp on the visual language that had already been established by the other directors.
It's interesting, as because I do often come in as a guest director, and so when I was a young director, I actually thought that I was supposed to hide like my personality
Oh
by
my.
imitating what the other directors did. And somebody mentioned once, they're like, Millicent's a really good director, but I can't tell her work from anybody else's. And I was like, ooh.
Mm,
And I came out of music videos. So at that moment, I realized that it's the balance. It's the balance of being able to use the language that's been established for a project,
mhm,
but make it your own. You should always bring yourself and your own personality to it and your own interpretation of the material and that moment in a series. So as now, whenever I approach something, I always, do all of my research. I watch
mhm.
anything that I possibly can to understand, like, oh, this is the type of lenses that they have. This is the type of visual language that they're using. And then I kind of put it in the back, recesses of my mind
Mhm.
and visualize it freely just for me, so that you don't get encumbered with, oh, I have to do somebody else. I have to do me.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I have to do me and to interpret the material in a way that I can bring truth and light to it. And then you work back into, okay, this is the language of the show, and I'll put it back into it.
Yeah, and despite jumping on more than midway through the show's run, you were also kind of tasked with introducing viewers to the world of Supper at 6 beyond the brief flashback that we see in the first episode. And I read that there was kind of a real intention to keep the camera alive and to keep that space fresh and new at all times. So talk a bit about what you did in order to accomplish that.
Myself and the DP, Zach Geller, stayed in that studio for like, I think it was 3 days. And
Wow.
we went through everything. And it really was, I mean, Kat, the production designer, created a wonderful set. And it had so much character. And
Mhm.
the way that I wanted to approach it was that it was a character, the set was a character in the story. And we were introduced, and that was what was lovely about this project, is that each block had like a different kind of section of Elizabeth's life. And
Right.
so we all had a different we had a different Elizabeth, so we had a different story. So it was, even though it was a series, it was like your own little block was its own little movie. And so for
Mhm.
my block, especially my first episode, it was Supper at 6. And so I thought, well, if this is a character, there has to be a story. There has to be a story of how we see it and how it interacts with Elizabeth and the arc of what we're talking about, and to always keep it alive. I mean, sometimes
Mhm.
when you get into a set, it almost feels like when you're in a courtroom, right? And it's like wide meeting
Yeah.
closed. It kind of feels
Yeah.
boring. And so Zach and I would go through and we'd look through every crevice. I found the shot where she's looking through the oven, and I was like, I mean, we went through everything. It's like, well, we went up in the rafters and looked down.
Wow.
It was just, how do we always keep this fresh and new
Mm.
and exciting? And when we shot for an entire week, and it was mind numbing. So because they when you shoot a block, they put everything together. So we were just in Supper at 6 every day for a week, and it's like, okay, which way did we approach this? We're gonna go this way, and I had it all mapped out. It was like, for this scene, we're here, we're there, and we have all the cameras spread around, and we made sure that we showed every aspect of Supper at 6 and kept it
Mhm.
alive and kept it pertinent and kept it involved in the storytelling of Elizabeth's journey.
Yeah, and you said that you spent like an entire week in there, and did that kind of help you like familiarize yourself with the space? Sometimes when you're in a space for very even if you're spending your entire time there, sometimes that kind of helps you understand the space a bit more. So would you say that that kind of helped in some ways to keep it alive and to keep it fresh?
Yeah, I knew every crevice of Separate Six. The inside, the outside, the back, the upstairs. I knew the little booth that looks down on Separate Six was so tiny, and we had to try to shoot there. And I was like, I can't get all the cameras in, and how do we do this? And it was, yeah, we have many a night. Separate Six was a lot. One of my favorite shots, though, actually, which probably no one will think this is my favorite shot. My favorite shot was in the dressing room, and it has the little globe lights, you know, that are on the lights. And it was in between takes, and Brie was standing there, and she was dressed up, and she was just standing. It's actually
in the trailer.
I think it might be, and she's standing there looking. And I took a picture with my phone, and I was like, oh my God, you look so amazing, you know? And it felt very Grace Kelly in that moment. And I was like, you were literally, that moment encapsulated taking us back. Like for me, it took me back to the 50s. It was everything about Grace Kelly. And it was just the simplicity of this mirror, you know, this mirror desk and makeup desk, and her standing there, and she was just standing there. And it spoke to me so much. It's one of my favorite shots.
Yeah, I feel like I know which moment you mean, but I think I'll definitely go back and check to make sure it's the right one.
Yeah, it's in her dressing room. Just think Grace Kelly.
Just think Grace Kelly, I will. But, you know, the episode at the same time also explores, you know, the mindset of Elizabeth's daughter, Mad, played by the wonderful Alice Halsey, as she's trying to learn more about her father and is also dealing with her mother's new work schedule and her new fame. And, you know, it's really easy to get caught up in the charm that Alice brings to the character, but this is still a very, you know, serious storyline in some way. So talk about giving the storyline its fair treatment and working with Alice on bringing it to life.
Well, Alice is an extraordinary actress, to be so young. I mean, she really is gifted, and I look forward to seeing where she goes in the future. She has a very, very, very bright future ahead. She's very smart. She's a very smart young lady. And so we really sat down and talked about it. It's like, and you know, her parents are there, and she has two wonderful parents that support her. And we just talked about like how she could relate to it as Alice could relate to what Mad is going through. And it's in very much the same way that I talk to an adult actress. It's like how you bring you to the character to bring it alive. You know, so we talked about being in that situation. We talked about the truth that Mad is looking for, and the dilemma of, you know, wanting her mother to be successful and be happy, but wanting a mom, you know, and how does this little girl feel, and not knowing who her dad is, and trying to find who she is. You know, it's also a self-discovery. It's not only a self-discovery for Elizabeth, it's a self-discovery for Mad as well. And it's a wonderful journey that mother and daughter are on together. And we would sit down and talk, you know, every day we'd go through like, what is this journey? Like, where has Mad come from? Where is Mad going? And one of my favorite memories is there's a scene where Mad and Elizabeth are sitting together, and Mad's sort of sitting on her lap. And after all this, Mad says, you know, I'm sorry, because now I kind of understand what you're going through. Actually, and Elizabeth says she's sorry. They both apologize to each other because they start to understand each other's perspective a little more, and to open up to each other despite the hurt, the pain. And you know, when they were sitting there doing the scene together, it was interesting because Brie got a little emotional, and then Alice like looked at her, and Alice came to me in between takes and said, you know, Brie was crying, and I said, yeah, she was. She said, And then I went to do Alice's coverage, and then Alice started crying. You know,
oh my God.
Yeah, it's like, okay,
real mother-daughter love.
Yeah. And then that very last scene where when Elizabeth opens the box and shows her the stuff that she saved from her brother, you know, when I read it, it wasn't the way that it ended up when we shot it. Those two very talented actresses took the heart from the prior scenes and really breathed life into that moment in a way that when I originally read it, it wasn't there. but it was so much better when we shot it.
It's such a beautiful relationship, and you already mentioned Elizabeth's brother, which kind of takes us to episode 6, and there's so much to talk about when it comes to this episode. But I do actually want to start with the flashbacks to Elizabeth's childhood, because I feel like flashbacks can so easily go wrong. And
Yeah.
in this case, they're really, really important because they kind of shed light on, Elizabeth's relationship with her parents, with her faith, with chemistry, and so much more. So walk me through the process of kind of weaving those flashbacks into the main storyline and ensuring that they serve their narrative purpose in this episode.
Well, that goes to Lee Eisenberg
Mhm.
because Lee was really fabulous. The scripts were very tight. He took a lot of liberties from the original book, and I think they were all liberties for the best. And really, really took care of the story. Contemporized it enough so that we understood, but kept the basic heart, the heart that was very true to the book. And this is a very important element that really gives you insights at why Elizabeth is how she is. And
Exactly.
everybody is trying to figure out, like, everyone just thinks she's just this really harsh, stiff human being,
Exactly.
except for when she's with her daughter, and you don't know why. So then you get this information that gives you the backstory to, oh, this is why this woman is the way that she is. And you start to have empathy and sympathy and understand, and there's so much more depth to how she put on the shield, that there's a
Yes.
reason the shield is protecting her. So she's not mean, she's protective, which sheds a different light on how you interpret who Elizabeth is. So we took a lot of time to look at locations. I mean, one of the wonderful things that I love about doing period work is, you live in a place and you walk through it, and you don't really think about it in the past, unless
Right.
you're really so much in Europe. In the United States, you don't so much. And you start looking at buildings, especially in Los Angeles, and we're like, oh, that's a 1930s building, and that's a
Interesting.
1930s building, and bringing it back to life. And it's the wonders of filmmaking, when you put the cars and you put the wardrobe and the makeup, and you're like, I'm taken back to a time. So one of my pet peeves is when you do period pieces is we sanitize the time period, and we kind of
Yes.
we make it too crisp and too clean. And just like in modern times, life is dirty. It was dirty back then too. And so, we made a conscious effort to not make it like everybody's Krispy Kreme and in the 30s, everybody's fabulous. It's like,
Mhm.
nah, that's not how they were. They're not, even the tone that we took with it, the cinematic texture of it. It's like it had to have weight. It had to have authenticity. It had to feel grounded and real, and especially the subject. Excuse me, the subject that we were dealing with.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, this young man committed suicide
Yeah.
because his father couldn't accept his homosexuality. Like he just couldn't. I have a shirt that says "Love is love." He couldn't do that, and lost his child. And she lost her best friend, and it's affected her forever. And believe it or not, we still experience that today. People still
Right.
having those very closed off, antiquated sentiments. And just like when we did in the 1950s, we did the sit-in. It was
Yes.
important for me to show that that the person who was the hardest, who had the hardest shell, and who lost the most was the father,
Mm.
because he couldn't bend, he couldn't love enough to love his son for who precisely who he was, and suffered the biggest loss of losing this child who could have breathed so much light and love into his life, and losing his two children. I mean, he lost his daughter that day. He lost
Yeah.
his son. And so because of your staunch beliefs, you're gonna sacrifice the future of two people. That's the biggest life. That's the biggest loss. And so we figured that, this man, we wanted to show this man, but we wanted to show that he was pathetic, and and that there was so much more that this young man could have contributed to the world and could have contributed to Elizabeth. And this is the loss that she's feeling, and this is the person that she's become.
Well, thank you so much for adding that perspective. That adds a whole new layer to the many layers that are already in those flashbacks. And you already mentioned the sit-in, because and that kind of takes us to the relationship between Elizabeth and Harriet, which is really like at the heart of this sixth episode. And the episode is really about contrasting their respective struggles, their respective fights, and highlighting Elizabeth's blind spots when it comes to recognizing those contrasts. So talk a bit about walking that tightrope of showing those contrasts and showing Elizabeth's ignorance thereof, while at the same time, not trivializing Elizabeth's fight, because I don't feel like the show is interested in that at all.
Yeah. When I took this project, I was interested in it because I understood Elizabeth's journey as a Black female filmmaker in an industry that is primarily white male. I understand her struggle and her fight just to be recognized and heard for who you are and your capabilities, not because of your sexuality or your skin tone. And so in this particular, storyline, I kind of got all of the parts of it. And to me, as a director, when I get a storyline like this, I don't think that I don't exploit pain just for pain's sake. I always want to get deeper into, like, why are we showing, Black pain or female pain? Like, why are we showing this? What's the purpose behind this? And to me, if we don't humanize the struggle of these characters so that anyone watching can see that what happened to them and the inequality is so wrong from a human level, and it's not even that, oh, I experienced it, I know, or I didn't experience that, I have no idea. No, from a human level that this woman feels like she is capable and is not being able to rise up. And on a human level, that these Black people who are homeowners deserve their property values not to go down, and they deserve a place to live, and they deserve harmony. What was interesting is that these two women who were friends, there's a disconnect, and to Harriet's. What I loved about Harriet is Harriet wasn't afraid to go there and tell, because you could see the love of these two people. If she didn't love Elizabeth, when they're sitting in that kitchen, she wouldn't have taken the time to stand up and school her. Yes. She would have just been like, I'm out.
Yeah.
And not told her, look, you actually should be the very person to understand my pain, because you've experienced discrimination in a different way, and that discrimination is discrimination for whatever reason, for being gay, for the color of your skin, because you're not blonde, because for your religion, it's not right. At a certain level, humans are humans, and by virtue of being a human, you should get respect and you should be treated on the same level. And ultimately, that's what these two women understand. So to Elizabeth's credit, Elizabeth is like, oh, I have to do this for me. And then when her friend breaks it down, like, no, you have an obligation to understand the struggle, because it's a struggle that you are going through on a different level, but it's still a struggle. It's still the same basic struggle. And Elizabeth thinks about it and it was like, yeah, I do. I have to support, because inequality is inequality, whether it's because I'm a female, or it's because it's somebody who's Black, or it's because of my sexuality. It's wrong. And she takes a stand.
She absolutely does. And, when I talked to Asia Naomi King, who plays Harriet on Friday, we kind of talked about how that friendship, as you were also kind of talking about just now, is really the catalyst for that honest exchange that they have in this episode. It's what allows them to have this conversation. And it's it kind of puts everything together. And I think that's a really interesting way to also show this honest exchange between the characters.
Well, when we shot the protest, is interesting enough, it was one of our shorter days of filming, and I thought it was going to be one of the longest. And everybody was the crew, the cast, everybody was really dedicated to finding truth in this moment. And this protest, which was based on a real protest, there was no photographic evidence of it. So I did a lot of research to figure out, what would this be? I read everything that I could read on it, and then I looked at photos of other protests that were similar to it. And so we kind of just recreated it. And for me, it was to really show how it affected the humans.
Exactly.
How it affected Brie, who's on the outsides of it, and how it affected Harriet, who's on the inside, and her family, and and the breaking of all these characters' hearts. I think what was special about this is you weren't just watching strangers in a protest being brutalized. You were watching characters that you got to know and love, and you saw the injustice, and you understood why this was so painful to them and why it was so wrong. And when we were shooting, it's crazy because it was triggering for everybody, the entire crew. At one point, I looked over, the whole crew's in tears, and I was like, okay, but we have to do this. This is our job. We can't sugarcoat it, and it was triggering, but it was supposed to be triggering. And all the stuntmen that were playing the white police officers, when they first went in there, they were gently pulling out the protesters. And I kept going, you can't be that gentle. And they're like, yeah, but this is like rough. And I was like, no, at that time, they were not gentle. We're doing a disservice to the fight and the struggle that real people went through by not showing it authentically. And the Black people in the protests, they were like, I want to fight back. And I was like, no, you can't. There's a wonderful moment when Harriet's husband is just pulled away, and he couldn't. Paul James is the actor, but he was submissive, and that's difficult. Yeah. It's difficult to be that aggressive for the police officers because it breaks your heart, but it's also really difficult to just be submissive. And what people went through in the 1950s when they were like, when they were heeding the words of Martin Luther King, and they were like, no, you do not fight back. That's hard.
Yeah, of course.
And so to really land this, we had to be authentic, and that hurt, and it was triggering. And I know a lot of people watched it and they were triggered by it. And it was triggering for us to do it, but we didn't want to exploit it to a point where it was not realistic, but we also didn't want to underplay it and sugarcoat it. So we wanted it to be authentic as possible so that the right amount of emotional weight was connected to that scene.
Yeah, you never want to water it down, right? You never want to water down that pain. So I can imagine that was very difficult to film for everyone. And before we wrap things up, we're almost out of time, but I didn't get the chance to ask this, to ask Asia this on Friday, but was Harriet grabbing Elizabeth's arm, was that something that was scripted during the, the sit-in, or was that something that Asia improvised? Because I don't know why, I felt like it added such a touch to that scene that I can't even explain, but I definitely took notice of that. So was that scripted, or was that kind of added by someone?
It was absolutely scripted. Mm-hmm. It was scripted, but she, I believe it was scripted in a different spot.
Okay.
And she put it in the right space. That's all I can say is like, it was there, but it wasn't in the spot where she did it.
Okay.
And it fit perfectly in the moment. I love working with Asia and Brie and all of the cast in the show. And there was such truth in their performances. And, I appreciate that they trusted me as a director, and they had a lot of trust that they would be able to live in a moment and feel in a moment and be unbridled in that and take liberties. And they all did. And I think we had a wonderful outcome.
I can only agree with that. The outcome is absolutely wonderful. And that's kind of a perfect note for us to end on here today. Millicent, thank you so much for walking me through your process. I learned so much from this. And thank you for taking the time to talk about it with me today.
Thank you. This is fabulous.